I'm glad to hear that the FTTH Council Europe expects a big turnout at the conference next year. I wonder if it's got anything to do with the location. I suspect when you go to a place like Marseille or Valencia, you tend to go to the beach for some of the sessions rather than sit in the hall. So on that note, I'm not going to keep you long, certainly not 45 minutes, because I see a few faces that look like they want to go and test the local waves and do a bit of surfing before the day is over. We are doing research on fiber to the home, fiber to the business, the building in a number of African countries. For various reasons, we started a bit late this year. That study is still ongoing. We're still waiting for much of the data to arrive, and hopefully we'll conclude the whole exercise within a month or so, and that report will be available through the FTTX Council Africa. I'm not whether it be sent by email or probably off the website for download. But we'll go through some trends, and if you have any questions along the way or comments, please feel free to interject, make it interactive. Just to illustrate where we're at in Africa and whether Africa is moving anywhere, not moving anywhere. And as part of the research process, we're looking at effectively 7 key markets, Mauritius being one of them because of the strategy they chose. And we saw a presentation yesterday how they effectively have now passed all the homes on the island, connected 75% of them, effectively replacing DSL with fiber, coupled with fiber as a concerted strategy. And then South Africa is one of them, and then 5 other markets, Ghana, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Tanzania. So the slide that I put up on Monday as well in the workshop, the reason we are seeing greater effort in rolling out fiber is because of effectively the subsea cable revolution, which started the past decade in 2009 on the east coast of Africa with additional cables, and then expanded to the west coast of Africa. That resulted in greater capacity, greater bandwidth available to connect us internationally, and through competition, lower prices. And that drove expansion of inland infrastructure through long-haul metro, and now we're seeing that proliferate in the access environment, and fiber is a very important component of that. So we saw increasing uptake of services and data usage in the mobile broadband space. In the case of South Africa, DSL, fixed wireless, and then fiber started making its mark and beginning to replace some of the other technologies, in fact, such as DSL in South Africa and elsewhere in Africa. That's beginning to happen as well. So if we look some of the sort of top-line statistics for the African continent as a whole, from just pure mobile population penetration to mobile broadband penetration within the population, the PSTN, the traditional copper fixed line connectivity to the houses, and then fiber broadband, fixed broadband specifically, and fiber in its own right. We see that Africa is still effectively a mobile environment and will remain so. Other technologies will come in, they will have their role, but for the vast majority of the population, particularly consumers, mobile is what it's going to be going forward over the next few decades, I suspect, and beyond. But as those technologies improve through improved spectrum utilization, effectively, though the mobile technologies will be able to service the market, the broadband market, quite adequately. But there will be room for other technologies in the fixed line environment, and they'll continue to expand. And they will continue to attract larger ARPUs. If we look at the FTTH environment, fiber to the home, fiber to the business specifically, we've got 96 commercial operations networks already up and running throughout Africa, not in all the countries. There are countries that still haven't really started deploying fiber, and there's still some of them still struggling with proper 3G deployment and certainly 4G deployment, and they haven't learned to count to 5 yet, so they're not thinking about 5G in any near future. 96 seems like a lot. There are countries such as South Africa where we've got a lot of networks, a lot of fiber network operators on the ground. A lot of countries have maybe a single network from the incumbent or a challenger to the incumbent or a couple. So it's not an even picture throughout the continent. It's quite skewed, particularly with South Africa as part of that environment. But we are seeing new networks being planned. So there are new networks coming in into the access fiber environment, and will continue to do so as the business case presents itself as a viable case going forward. On the mobile broadband, 145 commercial, maybe more now, 4G operations. New networks being planned, particularly in countries that have few 4G networks, or a few of them that have no 4G networks at this point in time. And 5G is already beginning to appear on the horizon with pilot cases in Lesotho and in South Africa. And we will see others, but that wave is still a few years away. If we look at Africa and sort of looking at the fiber in a broader broadband and fixed broadband perspective, on the fixed line side, mobile broadband side, this represents growth in millions of connections for fixed broadband in total in Africa. So it's not a lot for Africa. It's effectively 60 million connections for several million households and population of about 1.3 billion by now. But growth is taking place, not at an astronomical pace, not even maybe very fast growth, but it is progressing. And a large component of this is fixed wireless access. So technologies that sometimes are considered mobile, but they will be microwave, anything from microwave / radio to 4G fixed applications, and some DSL in it as well. And then obviously fiber is beginning to represent a greater component of it. If we look at Africa globally in terms of fixed broadband connectivity as a percentage of household penetration, we're still around the 6% mark at the bottom of the chain. All the other geographical regions, continents in the world are quite a bit higher, quite a bit more penetrated than Africa as a continent. But Africa is also very diverse. So there are countries that are close to this. There are countries that are significantly lower than 6, maybe less than 1% penetration. Mobile picture is different, and as we've seen, so in excess of 500 million connections, mobile broadband SIM cards. Vast majority of these, probably about 80%, is still 3G. And as we know, 3G doesn't necessarily provide high quality, high speed broadband. Sometimes it feels more like almost a dial-up connection that we've got. But 4G is making its mark. So as we progress, 4G will start replacing a lot of the 3G devices in people's hands, and therefore the connectivity as well. So there will be a growing experience in terms of quality and speed of access and quality of services received. As we see, the growth pace is picking up. So there's a concerted effort from operators to drive data usage by putting devices into people's hands. A lot of operators still practice subsidizing devices to some extent in order to make sure that the smartphones get into people's hands, and forever looking for the next lower cost device. So we've got devices, quite a few devices using 4G already below $100 mark at a retail price, and now trying to import more at about the $50 mark and moving lower from that. If we look at the different regions in Africa on this graphic at the bottom, all of Africa, about 40% population penetrated in terms of mobile broadband. North Africa as well, a lot of it has been taking place, and less in sub-Saharan Africa. And if we look at the top markets, South Africa again, we've seen quite a healthy growth of 4G devices mobile devices coming into the market and into the subscribers' hands. And then Kenya, Nigeria, two other strong markets, regional markets. There are some small markets that, we've got smaller markets such as Botswana, for instance, where the case is also improving, but the overall population is small, so they're not big contributors to the, let's say, the continental picture. If we look at the FTTH market specifically, top FTTH markets in Africa, again, SA at the forefront, but we do see Mauritius in a close second. And in terms of Mauritius from a household penetration level, by fiber and contribution to the mix of fixed broadband services, it's in the lead. And the reason is that, as we've heard, they have made a concerted effort of putting fiber everywhere, made that decision about 3 years ago to roll out fiber, migrate customers actively from DSL to fiber, effectively prepare the country for the fourth industrial revolution, prepare it to be very competitive going forward over the next couple of decades. And they've gone through a sales drive in order to ensure that the houses are getting connected on fiber from other technologies. So obviously there are other technologies as well, fixed wireless, but because of the size of the small size of the island, the ability to roll out fiber everywhere just makes sense, probably from a price competition perspective as well, to use fiber-based services, use that fiber connectivity. Other markets, thereafter, this is the top 8 and declining quite rapidly. So just presentation of reflection of the fact that even though we hear about fiber quite a lot, it's only really beginning to happen in many markets at this time, and many markets still lag behind for various reasons. So there was a wave initially in a couple markets, such as Kenya a few years ago, where initial rollout started taking place, then it slowed down as uptake wasn't quite, I think, what the operators expected. Now it's beginning to, we're seeing a galvanization of that environment. So again, operators revisiting more active deployment of fiber infrastructure, and also trying to pursue sales for fiber products. Nonetheless, the factors that still retard fiber deployment are normally higher cost of deployment than we see in South Africa or some of the other Southern African countries. Part of it is lack of other infrastructure that supports the telecommunications infrastructure, and that impacts negatively on the speed of rollout, ability to maintain and support those networks thereafter, or the cost of that maintenance. And it's also disposable income levels on the residential consumer side and business maturity on the business side. So the middle class is very small in many of the African markets, and disposable income levels overall are relatively low, while fiber service providers tend to charge a premium because they can. It's seen as a high-end service serving a high-end market, therefore a high premium, high prices are charged for this, and that obviously prevents uptake of those services in the lower market segments, lower LSMs or socio-economic classes, just can't afford it. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg, and I think until such time as we see growth of the middle class, reduction of cost in deployment of fiber, operators will start rethinking business cases, and we'll see further deployment of fiber in the residential space. As far as business is concerned, to a large extent, it's a factor of maturity. And as we see businesses maturing to cloud services, greater use of IT services to run their operations more efficiently on a daily basis, they will need fiber, especially once they go past the small size into medium size and larger corporations. Fiber is practically unavoidable, becoming unavoidable. And it will trickle down to smaller companies as well, where price is a more important factor. So that's the other element, price. Again, fairly high services costs for retail prices for fiber-based services, which prevent many, especially smaller businesses, from taking up those services, making use of fiber. If we look a bit closer to home, South Africa is the biggest fiber market in terms of the actual number of houses passed, connections that we have achieved to date. As of end of June this year, we've estimated just over 1 million homes passed. That excludes the business environment, so that these are the connected businesses. So we're moving along. Have done fairly good progress on homes passed and also homes connected, and we're looking at about a 32% connectivity rate, connections based on fiber connections based on the number of homes that have been have effectively access to fiber, whether they've whether they're ready for service or not. Even the houses that are not ready for service, within a month of placing an order, normally they're able to be connected. So the pace of this growth has also increased in absolute numbers, so we expect to see that happening. As far as how homes passed are concerned, the addressable market is estimated anywhere from sort of at this point in time 2.5 to 3 million households maybe. As far as that's based on the current retail prices of fiber services that are offered. That could easily double if some of the projects that are being looked at now in the lower socioeconomic segments of the consumer market bear fruit, and operators start moving into lower disposable income level households, into so-called locations on a mass scale, that the number of those households could easily double to 6 million, even go up to 10 million over time. But at the moment, everyone's looking at that sort of 2.5 to 3, maximum 3 million addressable market, and that build will begin to taper off as those neighborhoods are covered effectively with at least one network and maybe some overbuild with additional networks when the opportunity presents itself. So the focus will be on going back and emphasizing uptake of fiber services. So we expect that this growth will continue to grow at relatively high levels, while this will start tapering off over the next couple of years, and subsequently we'll see increase in the penetration rate or the connectivity rate on fiber, so probably going up towards 40% and beyond in the next couple of years. Businesses consist of sort of the so-called fiber to the business, effectively a broadband contended service with no quality of service, no SLAs on it. So it's the best effort. The best effort is normally quite good, but it's a lower cost service and normally used by small businesses in the SME market. And then also we have a larger component of Metro Ethernet links with some sort of a quality of service on them, offering service level agreements and so forth. And there's been an active drive from OpenServe to start replacing Diginet, which is, I think, due to be terminated probably by next year. We'll see the last of Diginet in South Africa, the traditional copper-based lease lines. They're being replaced by Metro Ethernet links, by fiber, effectively. So that's a big driver at this point in time in growth in the Metro Ethernet connections. The business connectivity, FTTB, had a bit of a slower start. A lot of operators were focusing on the residential market to begin with. Now they're actually starting to refocus on office parks, and there's quite a bit of effort going into bringing fiber into office spaces and trying to conclude sales with businesses. So we expect to see strong growth in the business environment as well going forward. A couple of slides that those of you who attended the workshop on Monday would have seen, but this presents the fixed broadband environment in South Africa and fiber in relation to other key fixed broadband services, namely DSL and fixed wireless access, which is becoming quite prominent and growing. And part of that growth is driven by provision of wholesale or open access, almost wireless networks, offered by Rain initially, and also now by Subsea, offering wholesale fixed LTE products to retail service providers, to the ISPs. So that's proliferating, increasing the number of service providers catering to the end users, increasing competition. That translates often into price competition, but also an effort to actually go and get customers by the service providers. So that's at the moment driving fixed wireless access. And should the government's the planned wireless open access network, national network materialize in the next couple of years, we expect that competition to intensify, prices to decrease further. That will be also driven by government's intervention in that market, and growth in fixed wireless access connections. Not to say that they're going to necessarily replace fiber, they're more of a complementary service. So in some areas and market segments, they'll compete with fiber, particularly sort of the cusp of some residential market segments and small companies, small office, home office, but they'll also go into areas where fiber is not going to go necessarily in the next few years, and DSL is disappearing from as copper lines effectively recede in South Africa and diminish. Telkom OpenServe now normally doesn't replace copper in instances where it's been stolen once or twice. Just either provides a wireless service or ends up deploying fiber, extending fiber from street-side cabinets into the last mile environment. So what are we seeing? Say at the moment in 2017. And this is purely household connections on FTTH at 318 and another 130 or so business connections, 130,000, and fairly close to the fixed wireless environment, the number of connections that we see. DSL is still at dominating the market, but we are going to start seeing that crossover in the next few years. And as far as market share is concerned of those technologies. So if you look at this, probably expect to see, probably in the next year or so, I would suspect we're going to see a diminishing number of DSLs as it continues to decline quarter on quarter, and growing number of houses connected. And then also at a later point in the future see a crossover between fixed wireless access solutions and DSL itself, and fiber to be a number of houses connected, dominating the market at closer to 60%, about 57% by the year 2022. If we look at global placement of African markets, just as part of the summary of the presentation, based on studies conducted by iData, we saw yesterday that Mauritius is now ranked at number 8 in terms of connectivity. They achieved close to 75% household connectivity. All the houses effectively have access to, all the households access to fiber as of earlier this year. And they're the top. Initially, they were the only country out of Africa to be placed in the top global ranking. Now they're part of the top 10. Is the only country out of Africa. That top 10 is dominated by Asian markets, countries such as quite a few countries in the Middle East, Arabian Peninsula, South Korea, Japan. They're quite heavily fiberized. But now we also have South Africa appearing. Even though it's a much larger market in terms of homes passed and connectivity growing, still a small market in global terms. So only accounting for about, as far as FTTH penetration goes, about 2% of households. And connectivity rate itself has said 32% on the fiber network. And we're sort of towards the bottom there, I don't know, maybe number 30. But hopefully as the impetus continues, we'll be moving up these ranks, going past quite a few countries of similar size or smaller than we are elsewhere in the world. The fiber environment presents a number of challenges. Some of them we've mentioned over the past few minutes. Why is the deployment not any faster than it has been to date? But it also presents opportunities. Challenges, the costs are still quite high, even in South Africa. So we're looking at somewhere around, in South Africa, probably around 20,000 rands, a bit lower, a bit higher, depending on neighborhood or environment, and the methodology used, about 20,000 rands per house to go bust a house. About $1,500 in Africa on average. There is quite a bit of a difference between aerial and trenched, so subterranean fiber. Aerial is a lot less expensive. You don't need to do all the digging, and it could be as low as 1/3 of the cost of trenched fiber for fiber deployment. Socio-economic development levels are still quite poor in global relative terms. That hinders faster uptake of fiber. Obviously, that also prompts the service providers, operators to use technologies alternative to fiber to start providing services first before they decide to actually go and build fiber infrastructure. Still quite a bit of bureaucratic red tape in South Africa itself as well. We've got problems with municipal cooperation in some instances, or the speed at which local governments operate and issue wayleaves, for instance, ability to trench, put fiber in the ground, or even cross streets. In some of the other countries in Africa, we also have the problem of sort of local thugs preventing deployment of networks because they feel they're entitled to co-ownership of that infrastructure because they rule the neighborhood. And if companies don't cooperate, they'll easily sabotage the network, leading to delays. If the companies cooperate, effectively means that they're paying the local thugs for the privilege of rolling out fiber. So that increases the cost of that fiber. And sometimes it's not necessarily just an NRC, it's sometimes an MRC. So every month or every quarter you have to go and pay a little bit more to make sure your network stays where it's supposed to be staying. Fractured fiber access. So all the markets in Africa, just about all the markets where we see competition actually beginning to take place within the fiber industry is a fractured market, and that often creates delays because we're seeing deployment taking place on a piecemeal basis rather than greater geographic areas being covered, which would have probably led to more efficient deployment of fiber networks. Some of these smaller operations fail. They're not necessarily very integratable into other networks. That introduces delays in trying to integrate networks that have been acquired by larger companies, and it results ultimately in slower deployment of fiber than we would have otherwise seen, and consequently slower deployment of services. But all the challenges present opportunities as well. Whenever there is a negative, there's always a positive in order to retain balance in the universe. So what's positive in many African markets is the lack of development, positive for fiber. Lack of historical infrastructure development or insufficient development. It doesn't pose a problem from two perspectives. Often doesn't pose a problem from an integration perspective and having to integrate legacy networks with next generation networks. Networks that are quite small, DSL for instance, also doesn't present a problem from a competitive perspective. So fiber operators have a freer hand, so to speak. They're not challenged by the incumbents necessarily with all the technologies because the capability to challenge the new operators coming in is just not there, or it's very limited. So fiber operators can potentially prosper faster from a competitive perspective. Middle class migration growth is taking place. We're also seeing a migration towards gated communities. South Africa is a very good example of a lot of gated communities, but it's also happening in other countries in Africa, and that presents an opportunity for fiber operators. They prefer to go into a safe and more concentrated environment, better defined residential environment at first. And that will translate into office parks. Office parks are also beginning to emerge in other African countries, and that will also then prompt fiber operators to start targeting those. So that will lead to faster growth of excess fiber infrastructure. We're also going to see new models being introduced into Africa, new business models for fiber deployment and sale of fiber-based services to communities. So the lower socioeconomic classes are going to become an addressable market over the next few years, and there will be an effort to go and target those areas as well. And some of it is happening with government assistance, sometimes even government subsidies that we can probably expect, as the government historically in some markets, such as Nigeria, has tried to subsidize deployment of mobile broadband in certain parts of the country in order to bring on board, include a greater part of the population in the broadband revolution. We may see that happening in that cooperation taking place in the fixed line environment, the fiber environment as well. And again, the fractured fiber landscape does present an M&A opportunity. So those companies that are more successful are probably going to be maybe not necessarily spoiled for choice, but will have an opportunity to acquire and grow through acquisition rather than having to grow on an organic basis at a slower rate. So that, bar the integration challenges, it is going to spur growth as certain smaller companies, our failing companies, are taken over by larger companies, which will be able to provide services more efficiently, quicker, and use that to expand physically themselves. So if there are any questions, more than happy to stand in the limelight for a while and take any comments or questions. If not, I haven't tested the temperature of the water this morning, but it looked like there were some surfers out. So, yep, there's a question in the back.
We'll get you a mic, just hold on.
Oh, shout louder.
Yeah, he's got a mic.
Hi, just on your one slide when you had the homes passed of about 1 million in South Africa, the previous year was around 700,000, I think. What do you predict would be the year-on-year growth for the homes passed maybe for the next 5 years? Will it be 300,000 per year and level out there, or do you think we'll have more of an increase, maybe 400,000 or 500,000 per homes per year growth in the market?
If I remember correctly, we had about a 30% growth in the first half of the year this year. So let's say 50 to 60% for the year. We are just trying to think of the numbers. Yeah, we could. There are companies that are doing 15 to 20,000 a month. So we could quite easily see that for the next, and there is a concerted drive over the next year to 2 years. So we could quite easily see sort of say a 250, 300,000 and above growth of homes passed. So I'm just trying to think of our forecast over the next few years, but it is close to, in fact, in excess of 2 million probably over the next few years. So we are expecting quite a bit of build still to take place.
Any other questions? Dobek, then thank you very, very much for a very insightful summary of the industry in Africa. And thank you too for your contribution this week. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.